All right, everybody. Well, welcome to our fourth webinar of 2022, where we're going back to basics as we move through the 5 steps to a safer church. So this is the 4th step, and we're focusing on a practice of being restorative. So this has quite a few definitions of restorative, and today we're going to cover exactly what we mean by this. So we also want to recognize the Christian Reformed Church in the Christian Reformed Church that this coming Sunday, September the 25th, the 4th Sunday of September, we as a denomination are recognizing Abuse Awareness Sunday. If your church does not have this planned for this coming Sunday, that's okay. Any Sunday can be used to sensitively and pastorally raise awareness of abuse and observe this in worship. Now, we do also have several worship resources, and we're going to put that link in the chat box that your congregation may use, including links to order free bulletin inserts, which this year outline the 5 steps to a safer church. We also have sermon starters, liturgies, and a song of recommendations available as well on this link. All right, so I should start by introducing who I am first, and then I'm going to share all that we have today on our webinar. So my name is Becky Jones, and I'm Regional Catalyzer for Canada, Eastern Canada. And I do continue to work in several ways within Safe Church, and I'm helping to host this webinar today along with Eric Kas. And I have the great honor to introduce our panelists for this webinar today. So first we have Heidi De Jonge. Heidi has been the pastor of Westside Fellowship Christian Reformed Church in Kingston, Ontario for 10 years. She and her husband, Tim, have 3 daughters and a dog. Her doctoral project from Western Theological Seminary was entitled Truthing in Love, Engaging Conflict with the Disarming Love of God. Restorative practices are at the heart of her ministry and her family life. Next up, we have Jen Holmes Curran, who is a co-pastor alongside her husband, Tony, at Sherman Street Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She has been using restorative practices in a church context for about 10 years. Next, we have Anthony. Anthony works as a youth and family outreach worker with Archway Community Services. He serves on the Restorative Practices Task Force with Classis, BC Southeast, and attempts to use restorative practices daily in his work, church leadership, coaching, and family. We also have Liz Tolkamp, who serves as the Regional Catalyzer for Western Canada, which is BC and Alberta, and is the founding member of the Restorative Practices Task Force in Classis, BC Southeast. She was first trained in restorative practices in 2015, and since then has been using her restorative practice in a variety of settings, including children's ministry, pastoral care, and family situations. And finally, we have Eric Kas. Eric Kas is on staff with Safe Church and has been a church planter in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He has used the restorative practices to facilitate a variety of listening circle conversations with churches, as well as facilitate higher level conflict situations in churches as well. Eric.
All right, thank you, Becky, and thank you all of the panelists here today. It's been an honor to work with each one of these individuals over the past really several years for many of you, and especially over the past 6 months as each one of us has become trainers of restorative practices. And so I'm really excited about this webinar today, where we are focusing on practicing the practice of being restorative, or restorative practices, or restorative justice practices. And there's a lot of different terms here, and we hope that this gives a pretty good perspective for each one of you who this might be the first time you're hearing about restorative practices, or possibly you've been using restorative practices for a long time and you need a little bit more encouragement and inspiration to continue down the road, which often is challenging because it's a long journey with people and with one another as we lead. And it's not always the quick, easy way, but it's a way to continue to focus on relationships and with one another and with Christ as we follow after Jesus, and a way to take ownership of our actions, whether we're in leadership positions or if we're members of churches, to take responsibility and also to be respectful to each person, no matter who they are, where they're from, or how they may have harmed us in different ways, but continue the way of trying to be restorative. And so You might be wondering, how does this fit into Safe Church? How does this fit into abuse prevention? I thought Safe Church was about abuse response within the church. And you might be thinking, I would never actually put a perpetrator of abuse together with a person who's been victimized. In many ways, I'll say, yeah, that's right. And so I do want to share with you, though, why we're focusing on restorative practices within Safe Church and throughout many ministries within the denomination. And the reason for that is oftentimes in the work of abuse prevention, we have seen patterns that have gone on for a long time, yet very few ways in which either somebody is able to take the initiative to try to hold somebody accountable or to bring up, an issue that has harmed them. And we have found that a lot of times in our work of abuse prevention, it's as much about the culture of the system as it is about one member or leader. And so often we have cultures that enable different patterns to take place, whether it's a council or a group of individuals who enable different actions that affect other people in negative ways or harmful ways or potentially abusive ways. And so we believe that restorative practices brings the capacity of an entire community organization to address things in ways that are true, honest, and they enable the flourishing of each person within a community. And so that's why we're focusing on restorative practices in this webinar. And to further give you a picture of where restorative practices has been within the denomination, how it got started, I just briefly want to walk through a bit of the history and then share a few definitions of what restorative practices are not and what restorative practices are. And so this began in many ways at Synod 2005 when many recommendations were adopted. And a few of those adoptions were that Synod called all of our churches to preach and teach restorative justice as biblical perspective and to apply the principles of restorative justice to the problems of crime in our communities and countries. And further, another adoption that was made was that Synod urged congregations, schools, denominational offices, other Christian institutions, and homes to employ restorative justice practices. And so Synod, even in 2005, saw restorative justice practices not only as something that applied to criminal justice in our system in North America, but also in the way that we are with one another as parents or as homes and within our congregations. And so since that time, the CRC&A has partnered with specifically FaithCARE, a part of Shalem Mental Health, and we've had several instructors train many of us in the Christian Reformed Church in what it means to be restorative. And so Ann Martin has been one of those trainers. Mark Vander Venen has been one of those trainers. And also Bruce Schenk has been one of those trainers. And so we're so appreciative of their work. And more recently, we have become more partnered with Shalem Mental Health as they have now trained all of the people on this call to be trainers. And so we're able to offer at this point a 2-day training in restorative practices, which we see as the more proactive side of being restorative rather than the reactive or kind of the higher level conflict conferences. And it's been a joy to work with each one of these people. And so with that, I want to jump really briefly into what restorative practices are not and what they are. And so you can see this in a link that we have defined. I have defined in this brief write-up. And I don't know, Becky, could you put this link into the chat too? And so if you'd like to follow along, you may. But restorative practices are not tools that we can simply add to our toolkit or to our tool belt. Rather, restorative practices are a way of thinking and being with one another that builds capacity of respect for one another, responsibility to each other, and relationships with one another. Restorative practice changes how we use all of our tools. And second, restorative practices are not merely listening or talking circles. Restorative practices consist of a wide continuum of very informal ways of being with one another to very formal ways to address how actions have affected each other in safe and dignified ways. And so they can be as informal as, like for instance, if my kids were digging holes in the front yard, finding grubs for the chickens, which happened just 2 days ago, I could just say, stop it, like stop digging holes in our yard. Right? Or I could say, you guys, when you dig holes, it might cause somebody to trip on it. And I spent a lot of time trying to plant grass, and every time you dig a hole, it's an opportunity for weeds to fill our yard now. And so it shares how their actions are actually affecting other people. Two more, much more formal ways in which conflicts have been happening possibly in our communities for several years. And we have a very specific way to give people the ability to address what's happened, how they've been affected, who else has been affected, what's been hard for them, and to identify a way forward, what they're willing to do to make things right and what needs to be done to make things right. 3, restorative practices are not meant to be just reactive or used only when conflict happens. Rather, restorative practices are meant to be used proactively. We say 80% of the time, and reactively 20% of the time. So those are subjective numbers, but the hope is that we're able to use restorative ways of being with one another more proactively, and it builds our capacity as a whole. I often say when we take the small things that have harmed in small ways, in healthy routes to address those items, then we're far more likely to deal with the crises and the big issues that happen in ways that truly are dignifying of each member within our community. 4th, restorative practice is not merely done by outside facilitators. Rather, and there are times when an outside facilitator is helpful, but restorative practices are intended to give a framework for those within a system to lead more restoratively. Restorative practice is characterized by the unifying hypothesis that people are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And there's a bit of a social disciplines window there that it's alluding to, that we can truly be with one another rather than do things punitively to each other, or sometimes overly supportive, simply doing things for one another. 5th, restorative practice does not diminish leadership positions. Rather, restorative practice is a way to carry out fair processes, again, for leaders to do things with one another. Giving leaders a clear way to offer their communities engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity. Some of the key or 3 E words of fair process. And the final one, restorative practices are not owned by Christians or founded necessarily only by Christians, right? But 6th, that restorative practice is a part of a growing global movement that reflects the shalom of God and helps us as Christians to live out the gospel by providing structured processes to help us be united as the body of Christ, with every part being vital, every member being vital. And they offer us tangible ways to make every effort in keeping with the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And 3rd, it's an explicit practice of loving one another proactively and through a commitment to reconciliation when conflict and harm does occur. And so this is a part of being together in restorative ways. And this continues to develop in a host of different ways. And it's often seen as a social science that studies how to strengthen relationships between individuals, as well as social connections within communities. And so, and also modern restorative practices do have roots in restorative justice and circle practices and the use of a talking piece, which often we have found their roots in indigenous communities throughout the world. And so we also we recognize that this originates not just with Christians, but with the way that God has created us as image beings or image bearers in all places throughout the world that the Lord has made. And so those are the quick what restorative practices are not and what restorative practices are. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to some of our panelists to answer a few questions. And so the first question is, let's see, what has drawn you to restorative practices and what continues to draw you into the work of restorative practice in your context, in your community? And so why don't we start with Jen, and then we'll go to Heidi, and then Liz, and then Anthony. You're the next person on my screen. And so we didn't establish an order before this, but go ahead.
No, that's great. What has drawn me to this? I think I initially got trained in order to facilitate because I was a part of a community that was very, we just had a lot of barriers that we were trying to cross to communicate with one another. There's some socioeconomic barriers and also, I don't remember what the other one was that I was going to say. Well, I guess like levels of education, all sorts of things that didn't really cause outright conflict, but had people sort of resenting each other for, I think, what were cultural differences. And I wanted to figure out how to talk about that in a way that would be helpful for our congregation. So I got trained to facilitate. I think that probably could have helped me, but I didn't know how to do it in that particular problem. I didn't know how to do it then. I think I could do it well now. But what I saw immediately after I got trained was I got pulled into a conflict that I know that if I had not been trained in restorative practices, my response would have been to convince this family who was upset to stay, to be irritated at them that they were so sensitive, and then there would have been this kind of like lingering resentment under the surface for them, because we wouldn't have actually dealt with the problem. But I didn't know how else to approach things like that before. But when I got trained, they said, we have this fight. And I was like, this is like the first time in my life I've known what to do. We had a circle, and I have never, conflict instead of being a problem became this incredible resource. And just, we saw things come out of that conflict that I would never have expected. And it was just beautiful. So that really sucked me in. And then beyond that, I think just as a tool for helping my congregation through change or through discernment, or again, whenever conflict arises, that we actually have an expectation that people of peace, people with the ministry of reconciliation should reconcile with one another. I can say that and also say, I can help you do that, which is a real gift. So that's why I stay with it.
I can go next. Hello. So I've been in ministry for 17 years. The congregation I was in before this one, wonderful things about it. Don't regret being a pastor there. And it was a difficult setup, and the leaving was hard and complex. And when I got to my next church, I knew that I needed to find a way to lead differently than I had been leading and differently than I had been led. And the church that I've been in now for the last 10 years, we were doing some visioning work together, and we were recognizing that as a church, they too were looking for different ways to be together. In the 90s, they'd gone through a really difficult split, and because of that, had become a place that didn't want to talk about hard things because they were worried that maybe there'd be another split. And so just realizing as an individual, and the congregation realizing as a community, that we needed a different way of being together. We named a vision that's been one of several visions for us, but that we've worked with the last many years, that we would become a safe community in the safe church sense of the word, that where people could speak their truths in love and listen with love to other people's truths, including those of the surrounding community. And it was after we'd established that vision that I first saw a FaithCARE invitation to a training. And I thought, what? This is exactly what we need to learn how to do. And we can learn how to do this. And so a couple of us went to the first training, and we were both so excited. We took it back to our congregation, and we've been working as a congregation now for a long time. I mean, the last 6-7 years to incorporate the restorative culture into who we are. And I've been so captivated by this and continue to be captivated by it. I feel like it's becoming a part of my DNA. It's just the way I look at relationships and leadership and church culture and neighborhood culture. And I did in 2018, worked with Western Theological Seminary on my doctorate of ministry, where I was just studying conflict, because I find it to be this endless well of sometimes pain, but also hope when you dive deep together. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, but thanks. Good question.
Great. Thanks, Heidi and Jen. That's a good way to talk about it. Yeah. So what's drawn me to it? I think initially my first foray into thinking about restorative practices and restorative justice was actually being invited into a restorative justice conference due to a petty crime that had been committed by a young man in our church against my husband and I. It was an incident where he had stolen from us, and that the justice system here in British Columbia had invited us into a restorative justice conference. And so that was my first foray many years ago. And that incident, that experience never left my memory. And I was struck by how it led to a place of restoration for us and this young man who my husband mentored for many years as well. So you can imagine the betrayal and the hurt that we had felt and the harm that we had felt when that had happened. But to move into that experience and to have an opportunity to share how it impacted us and to hear from him why he had committed it was an experience that never left me. And so when I went, I'm originally a teacher by profession, and then went into ministry about 20 years ago, and moving into church ministry, recognizing that there's so many conflicts within the context of life, I guess, but also in the context of church. They're small, they're large, they're in between, and that interestingly, as people of faith and people who belong in community, we had no way to figure out how to address these conflicts. Often the conflict was something that was taken away from the people who actually should be dealing with the conflict. And, you come in with a mediator, or you come with a pastor, or you come in with a pastoral elder that says, this is how we should do it, rather than bringing in the 2 or the 3 or the people that are involved in the conflict and having them sort it out and figure it out. So I was looking for a third way. I was looking for another way. And through a mentor friend of mine who was really involved actually in some of the groundwork in the CRC, had invited me to a Restorative Practices training in 2015, and I've never looked back. I think Heidi mentioned this at one point. It's become part of her DNA. I think what continues to draw me to restorative practice is particularly, it helps me to be restorative. It continually helps me to think about my own way of being with people, whether that's my family, friends, congregation, children's ministry. That's one of the things, I guess. It's a way of self-reflection as well. But the other thing, and I think, Eric, you mentioned this so beautifully, I think in the opening of the webinar, the restorative approach just really values that the value of every person made in the image of God, and everybody has a voice and should be heard and should be seen. So yeah, it creates space for honest dialogue and vulnerability. I think Heidi alluded to that as well in what she said. So that's what continues to draw me to it. I've seen it. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Liz. What drew me to, or continually draws me, but what drew me originally to restorative practice is I used to be a youth pastor, and my church went through I just witnessed a lot of conflict in church, and I experienced a lot of unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict. We went through an 8-year building project, and we've saw a lot of staff come and go. And I just figured there had to be a better way to process some of that or work with some of that with the community and staff. And so then I got drawn to restorative practice training in the States, outside of FaithCARE actually originally. And just recognizing that we as Christians, Jesus, God is a restorative God, the gospel is restorative, and so we need to be restorative people. And so we talked a lot about restorative practices as a way of being, and I think that's something that I aspire to do, not only in my church work. I'm not in, I guess I still am in church, but also my community work. I work with lots of disadvantaged youth and families in the community, and they need restoring as well, restoring with each other. A lot of people live in conflict, and conflict seems to be a regular and normal thing for people, but not everyone knows how to process conflict or how to talk with conflict. And I think many of us don't know how to live in community when we don't agree with one another. And so I think restorative practice allows us to create frameworks and processes by which we can actually love each other, but not have to agree on everything. And so it continually brings me or draws me to, as much like Liz, I want to be a restorative person. And so it reminds me every day to be restorative. So my children are a good reminder of that when I lose patience with them. I do a lot of coaching as well. And so I work to set up restorative processes with all the teams that I work with, and how to communicate, how to work through conflict, because it's something that we don't teach very well. And we often experience conflict, but we don't know how to navigate it. And I think our culture and our churches are crying out for common language and a common way to understand how to be open and honest with people and still respect each other and love each other through it all. So I know Heidi has a good mantra about loving through, I forget what it is, but so I appreciate that. So that's kind of what continues to draw me, just the desire to be restorative and to continue to encourage other people to be restorative and be patient and gracious with those that aren't, and at times when I'm not. So thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, Liz, Heidi, and Jen. I know for me, when I originally became trained in restorative practices, actually by a former police officer who brought restorative justice practices to Detroit policing in several ways, Monica Evans, and in the way that she was able to communicate about her past, a variety of different situations, and the way she was able to share how it changed the way she parented as well. And then that was during a time in my life in which I was wrapping up a church plant, and I thought, wow, I wish I had these tools before I started my church plant, because it would have radically changed the way that I led as a church planter, and allowed for each person to be present in all of their differences. And I know for that group that I was starting with, it was such a wide, different, diverse group of people, from ethnic background to season of their life to ideological differences. And looking back, and it was in 2016, I thought, well, there were some things that might not have ever worked out, and that would have been okay. But restorative practices would have given me an opportunity to give voice and to lead in a restorative way. Because I think what I did was it kind of just faded. And so I'm like, oh, well, we're just going to step back for a little bit, rather than really led through a challenging time. And so that's where I appreciate each one of these people who've been trained, that they've been able to lead in different restorative ways, even though it's been challenging. And Becky, you can jump in on this too, if you'd like, to answer what has drawn you to restorative practice. And I know I just put you on the spot, and so you can just tell me if you'd like me to come back to you. But
no, I was actually just going to say, as you were all speaking, it's actually just exciting me about just moving into a new space and a new role with Regional Catalyst, and just thinking about how you go into different churches and understand the culture of the spaces. And just I've just been reading a lot about that aspect, and just understanding exactly what you said, like, what is the space of, like, what is the gift that each person brings to the table that you can really lean into so that you can come together as a community. So that's all I would add as I was thinking through all your responses, because it's been beautiful. So.
Thanks, Becky. And I'll ask the second question. And as I ask this question, we also would like to invite those who are participants in this webinar. If you have a question that's come up, please feel free to put that in the chat. You can chat just to panelists and hosts, or you can chat to everyone. And we will take that, and we might not be able to get to all the questions. And so, but we invite you to ask questions in the chat as this next question is being asked. And so a more tangible question: how do you use restorative practices in your congregation or context at this time? And we'll go in the same order that we did the first.
That's me. At this time, well, lots of ways. I mean, I am continually trying to reinforce, if you have a conflict, it's, you know, like the passing of the peace in church wasn't actually just a time to say hi. It was a time to be reconciled before you took communion. So I often will encourage our congregants to, like, this is a good chance for you to come and ask and say you need a circle. Like, if you need help resolving a conflict, this would be a good time to, like, show your dedication to the peace of our community. And like obedience to like half of the epistles, which is all about just get along. But beyond that, I think whenever we have had a big issue for discernment, restorative circles have given us a space to talk together that allows us to hear everybody's voice, which I think actually going through this so many times has taught me really the value of the body, like in a visceral kind of way, not just like, oh yeah, everybody belongs in the body of Christ, but like actually when you hear their voices, it turns out that wasn't just like a clever line from Paul. But I think that has made our discernment so much more robust. And beyond that, like, it also has this kind of bonus of people who don't get their way, and when there's a difficult decision and council makes a decision that maybe some people don't like, they're much more likely to be okay with that and to stick with the community if they've had an opportunity to say what they need to say. So whenever our church faces a tough thing, we generally go through a circle process and try to invite everybody to speak into the space. That doesn't mean that they're always the ones making the decision, and that we're not seeking consensus, but we do seek input and we want to know how people are impacted. We've used it, I mean, also in a number of sticky spaces, like we are hiring a youth pastor and we know that's a bit contentious. So we want to just talk to everyone about what the youth pastor job description should look like. And so in that space, we had 4 circles that had different participants. We invited the middle school youth to one, the high school youth to another, the youth leaders to another, and the parents to another, trying to give everybody an opportunity to speak into the youth ministry, which I could see. I facilitated the parents one and I could see it heading off some conflict just right in that circle. There's also, and I was just thinking as other people were talking, like, I'm really looking forward to trying to actually talk to the youth, which I did in my last church, and it was just remarkably fruitful. Turns out kids really like it when you give them the space to speak into their own ministries. So I'm looking forward to doing that, but we haven't done it yet in this church. So
I'm busy taking notes on what you said, Jen. Okay, I'll finish that note later. So my first exposure in my congregation was actually very early on in my time there. And it was way before I'd been trained, but we'd had a man who'd been attending the congregation who we didn't know, but was going under a different name. He was on the sex offender list in like Florida, and he'd kind of started attending our church and had made really deep connections to a lot of people. And then someone did some research, found out his background, and like just all of the tensions that erupted in the congregation. And so we had someone lead a circle. He ended up leaving, the individual left the church, but we still had a circle to talk about it, because some people were like, we just need to forgive him and move on. And others were like, he should not be here ever, you know. So it was such a powerful introduction to that. So that was long before I was trained. But since the training and introducing restorative practices into the culture of the church, we definitely do, we definitely use circles for difficult conversations, and for making harder decisions, for ending things. Like at the end of a year, we have a circle to talk. We bring the leadership of different ministries together to look back on the year, to look ahead to the year to come, and use the restorative questions in that. We also, you know, if when individuals leave the church, we have exit conversations with them, and we use the questions there so that people, as people like to slip away, they don't necessarily want to have the conversation, but if we can, if they're willing to have an exit conversation, we do that restoratively. And we, you know, the more people who get to know it, the more people end up using it in their families. We use restorative questions with our girls, and my now 16-year-old recently, you know, well, I don't know, there's so many stories. Well, she'll be, hey, we need a circle. So we as a family circle up, whether we're driving in the van fighting about where to go to dinner, or having a conflict about who said what over the dinner table. We use the questions to work through things as a family. And right now, I am finishing my time at my church, and we are using restorative practices to help us finish this season well, right? So all of my, when this came up that I was going to be leaving, processing that as counsel and with elders and with staff, and my exit interview that will come up, all of that's done restoratively, making sure all voices are heard throughout the process. So we can do hard things well with the questions and the circles and the practices of restoration.
Thanks, Heidi. I too was busy taking notes. You shared some things that I hadn't thought about yet, and thought, oh, there's some ways I could continue to bring restorative practices to my congregation. I've used restorative practices in a variety of different ways in the congregation. I love the proactive circles. Anytime there's an opportunity, I love to think of ways to use them. So just a couple of different ways here. Staff meetings. We've used the restorative approach in our staff meetings, which is basically you gather devotions, a check-in. We have no written agendas. The agenda is basically you celebrate a success, you share a lesson learned, and then you share what's coming up in your particular ministry or focus area within the church. And then we often have some kind of free open discussion, and then we end with a checkout. And that's basically the format of our staff meetings. So that's one way. Another one is I use it in children's ministry, often with older children, as a way to respond to a story. So questions like what's happened in the story, who's been impacted in the story, those kinds of things. So using the effective questions that way, responding to a Bible story, even something like Sagias or whatever. I've used the effective questions to process a parent complaint. A parent was upset with the way I dealt with their child on a Sunday morning. And so just brought the parent into my workspace at the church and said, tell me what happened. What were you thinking? And what have you been thinking since? And who's been impacted? And how can we move forward to make this right? So that was another very personal way. congregational meeting, we recently went through an Article 17 at the church I'm at, and using the effective questions in a congregational meeting and a town hall meeting. So twice we've done that. And I'm sure we'll, entering into the fall, we'll do the same thing. So just helping people to process what was the hardest thing through Article 17. What were you thinking then? What are you thinking now? And, you know, the question of what can you do? What's one thing you can do moving forward in terms of helping us come to a place of healing and restoration as a congregation. I've used the circle process to shape grief circles during COVID. So with another member in the congregation, inviting 6 people to a grief circle, and we shaped a liturgy around the effective questions. And so that was an incredibly beautiful experience, the grief circle. I've got a few more there, Eric. Do I just keep going? We had a staff let go. We had a staff let go, and just processing that with this. It was just before COVID that we had to let a staff go, and it was deeply harming for that staff member. And so we entered into a restorative conference with that. So in that context, I was not even a facilitator. I was a participant. That was a very interesting experience. But again, that was another way that it was used, that we processed as a staff, and listening to the person that was let go, how it impacted that person, what they were thinking then, what they were thinking now, you know, just asking those effective questions. And then I think Heidi mentioned this one as well, but in my own personal life and with a family meeting, using it. So my mom, at one point, we as a family decided she needed to be in a care facility. And just using, again, the restorative approach for the family to process, how's this impacted you, putting my mom into a care facility? What were you thinking then? And what are you thinking now? And what's been the hardest thing? And what can we do as a family to make this be a good thing moving forward? So I think I'll end it there. So I think this is just a plethora of ways in which restorative approaches can be used in church context.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, for that exhaustive list. I don't know if I can add to that. Yeah, in church, I'm chair of council at the moment, so we do all of our meetings in a proactive kind of restorative way. Our agenda is even, you know, we do have an agenda. Sorry, Liz, because we have to, church business, you got to work through stuff, but we kind of set it up in more of a restorative fashion. So we don't follow the agenda, but we don't try make it all about the process, but about just the seeing what people feel like, those kind of things. We're a small congregation, so we've had a couple town hall meetings, 2, I believe. One just to talk about famine, flood, and COVID, because our community experienced floods. So we actually met to just talk about that as a congregation. We had, I think, 20 people in a circle. Just processing that. We recently had at one of our council meetings, we invited extra people, and we just led a listening circle about what the feeling has been about our church. We, of course, COVID was tough on us. Then our building had toxic mold, so we lost our building, had to meet on Saturdays for a while. So and then our pastor went on sabbaticals as well. So we had all these things happen to our church. So we just sat with a bunch of people and just talked through how we're feeling, what we need to do as a church, and how do we need to move forward. So we had, and somewhat using the restorative question model, but just listening to people, giving people an opportunity to be heard. Yeah, so those are things in church. One of your, you also had a context question, Eric. I do a lot of work outside of church. So I get to do proactive circles I coach a lot of volleyball, and I work with the university team here, and we regularly meet in proactive circles to just learn how to listen and just develop a process of working through conflict and just sharing, so that when conflict arrives, we already established a way of talking about stuff and listening to each other. And that's been pretty powerful, just teaching young people to sit and listen, and sometimes sit in that uncomfortableness of what people say and not respond, and just like learn to take it as moments of growth and opportunities to share. And so we do that quite often. And actually every time I coach volleyball, every time I start and end. So just establishing processes of communicating. And I think we've all mentioned it, just allowing people to be heard. And council meetings too, I go around all the time, and if a decision is being made, everybody has to say something about the decision. You can't just sit there and nod your head. You need to like actually say it, what you think. So that's been big too. And in my job, working with young offenders, just through those questions, what happened? What are you thinking? What are you thinking now? And then even like, how do you need to restore yourself with the community, with the individuals you've offended, and with your families? And so, yeah, just being real, teaching people that it's not just a process, but it's a way of doing things. And I think proactive circles is a great way. And those questions are a great way just to continue to remind yourself that we need to do this as not as events or as, but more as just, this is how we need to be. And so those are encouraging ways to do that. That's all I got, Eric. Liz stole them all.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Anthony and Liz and Heidi and Jen again. And we did have a question that came through, and so now's a great time to start asking questions, as each of us may be able to weigh into them. And this first question, I think any one of us might be able to answer, and so I'm going to put it in the chat to everyone. And the question is, what helps encourage those key individuals in the conflict to participate when they refuse to be involved in the talking circles and be part of the conflict resolution? And my quick nudge of answering this is why we often try to encourage the proactive circles of, a big change is coming to the youth ministry. Why not have a circle for people to share how it might affect them, what might be hard for them if this comes to pass with the youth ministry. And in that, people are getting used to sharing their own language and voice and feeling like they actually do matter. I know when I have had conversations with people who have been a part of years-long conflicts, I often have people say, this doesn't feel restorative to me. and I validate them, and I say, I understand how this often is really challenging. But then my question back is, what other routes do we really have to help resolve the conflict? And oftentimes our alternatives to the conflict is to just ignore it or to leave. Which often further erodes the values of relationship in the body of Christ particularly, and erodes responsibility for actions that others may have taken or done. And it's just, it also erodes different levels of respect for one another as not only image bearers, but as fellow Christians in Christ. So yeah, that's my first stab. Jen, it looks like you have something to add.
I always have something to say. No, I just want to echo what you said, that the proactive circles, I think, are the key to helping people to trust the process, so that they can enter it into it. In my work, and then we've also had a number of housemates who have watched my husband and I fight, which is kind of weird, but has happened. All three of them, and then I've seen in lots of circles, a lot of people have never experienced what it is to resolve a conflict. And so they actually don't believe it's possible. So getting people into the circle is for sure the hardest part of it. But if you are, so the main conflict circles that I have done have been with people who've had some experience with this kind of process in the past. So integrating those proactive circles is really important. And then I think mostly patience. It takes a lot of courage.
I'd like echo everything that the two of you just said, taking notes again, because it's so good. And there are times, because we had a situation where a staff their hours were reduced, and then they decided to resign because they were upset. It was in COVID. We didn't need as much work. Anyway, big thing. And it was the surface of a conflict that had been going on for years. And so we actually brought in facilitation from FaithCARE because all of us were involved. None of us could facilitate kind of on the outside of it. And tons of work to try to lead up to this conflict circle. And in the end, there were two individuals decided not to participate, but they knew that this was going to happen no matter what. We were going to have the circle even if they weren't there, so that they didn't then get to control whether or not the circle happened with their not being there. We determined that the circle was still important to happen to heal the community because there was just divisions everywhere on this. So as much as it's ideal, of course, to have all parties there, you can't force it. You can't force someone to be a part of a circle. And you can still have a circle even if everyone's not there. And it just is a different kind of circle. So that's something I wanted to add.
This is going to sound manipulative, and I hope that it doesn't, but there's also with my kids, because we do circles with our kids all the time. Sometimes my son is like, I don't want to talk about it. And I'm not trying to force him anything. This is actually the choice he has. I'm like, well, you don't have to talk about it, but if you won't talk about it, then I'm going to give you a consequence like I would if we didn't have this tool. And so he has some extra motivation to do that, which I'm not saying you should like manipulate people into circles at all. They have to be voluntary, but there is this space too of like, well, a great solution can come if we can have this conversation together. If we can't have this conversation, then here's what I have to do. And that in some spaces is helpful to know that that's possible. In church work, that's a lot harder than with your kids.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, that's helpful, Jen. I think certainly with children, you can do that as a parent for sure. And I think the thing to remember, and I think all of us have touched on it, is that restorative practice and restorative work is truly by invitation. We cannot coerce people into it. And so like Heidi did say, then it is possible to have a circle without that person there. It just, the shape and the questions just become slightly different. And I think Jen touched on this too, just how important it is then that you have already in your congregation or in your families utilize the proactive circles a lot before in many ways you can even go to responsive circles. And yet church life is such that you do have a conflict and it's now, and you need to have some way to reconcile that conflict. But again, the more you're using the restorative proactive circles within your congregations, the more comfortable people will be when it comes to a conflict. They go, okay, yeah, I can be there. But again, ultimately it is by invitation. It is by invitation. Yeah. And I think in the background too, there's going to need to be a lot of pastoral care, a lot of conversation and pastoral care with the person that is reluctant or resistant to being there, because they do need to own responsibility. There is an element of that as well. So I think I'll stop there.
I'm actually fairly, I use quite a bit of authority when I'm dealing with my kids and wrongdoing. Like if I saw my 4-year-old just point blank, like hit his older brother straight from behind, like without any ability for the older kid to defend, I mean, like even brace, I'm like, okay, like you're getting the 10-minute timeout and you're going to talk about this. And if you don't talk about it using the restorative questions, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Now, what do you need to do to make things right? If he doesn't talk about it, he's going to stay in his room like for quite a while. And so that's another myth about the restorative thing, is to say, actually, there are no consequences, or, you can just evade the consequences. There's still a high level of expectations as well as high levels of support. And so it's not just this punitive consequence without anything else, but it is where there deserves to be level of consequence, especially for children to take responsibility, but also the follow-up of support. So
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Just the myth of no consequences. And we talk about this a lot, because the consequences of actually having to face what you did
Mhm.
to the people to whom you did it is a lot. That's a significant consequence in and of itself. But there are often more repairing type consequences that come out of circles, like things that people do to make right what has gone wrong, which is incredibly biblical understanding of justice, that it like repairs what is wrong instead of just punishment. Also has this like really wonderful benefit of, like, I stepped out of being restorative with my son recently and took away all of his screen time on Saturday because he put toilet water in my husband's water bottle. Anyway, and I took away his screen time, and he absolutely thought that I was the bad guy and that he was the victim. And I was like, hey, can you remember that you did something wrong? Like, it wasn't, I didn't just do this to you arbitrarily. But it reminded me through hours of arguing and him just like whining that he did not have any screen time, that when you actually do these things together and like require him to face what he actually did, he doesn't get the opportunity to feel like a victim. He actually just has to face what he did and know that the consequences that come from that are about repairing what he did, instead of just like arbitrarily no screen time where he is the victim in the situation.
Right.
Eric, one other thing too. I think, like not every process or sort of process feels restorative. I think that's important too. Like it's not always easy. Like, I think when you go through the process, you'll feel good in the end, but I think it's not always easy. Even I think I've experienced at times, working through restorative process with people, and I didn't feel that was very restorative. I've experienced, restorative processes that weren't really restorative at some points, and I think we need to just be honest too, that sometimes it's difficult, and it's working through the difficulties together where we can learn and grow and be better restorative people at the end, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Anthony. And we have already reached our hour together. Two same words in the same different meanings. Our hour is complete. And so I, again, thank each one of you for being present as panelists. And we thank all of you who are tuning in and watching. And I also want to share a few opportunities for trainings. I'm going to put this in the chat. They are also available through a network article. Which, Becky, can you post the network article as well? Andrew Apong is part of Office of Social Justice, and I will be hosting and facilitating a training in restorative practices that is 2 days long, focused on the proactive restorative practices, as well as listening circles. And this will be hosted at the Christian Reformed Church denominational offices in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so we're registering participants now. It's about $100 to sign up and includes food. And there are a few other opportunities as well. Liz will be facilitating a 2-day training with Sean Baker, a part of Pastor Church Resources. And that is happening in Northern British Columbia on Friday, November 4th and through Saturday, November 5th. And I believe we will have another one coming up soon, which Becky and Heidi will be facilitating, and that will be happening in Ontario. And so stay tuned for more details for that. And also, I just want to pitch a few other things. One, there is a cohort opportunity that we are gauging interest for, and this is in connection with the Thriving Practices cohorts. And so we'll put a few links in the chat to that as well. And we're still gauging where this is at, but there are grant funds available to pay for a coach and to walk through what it looks like to become a restorative congregation along with other congregations as a part of a cohort. And so let me know if you are interested in that opportunity. And to finally conclude, we again thank you for each of you are doing as members of churches, as well as leaders, pastors in your congregations, not for abuse prevention and response, but also to lead in the way of Christ. And and perhaps you want to learn more about this restorative way of being one another as the church. And so we're available for you, and we look forward to continuing to learn with you as well. And if this is if you'd like to further support Safe Church and congregational ministries, we do have a link at which you may donate and support our ministry. And we are not able to do this ministry without you. And so again, thank you for all the work that you're doing in your own congregation. And thank you for your support for Safe Church as well. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to stay in touch. Farewell.